Good morning. We are pleased to welcome all of you, distinguished speakers and guests, to the 2025 BOJ-IMES Conference. Thank you very much for your participation. The first BOJ-IMES Conference was held back in 1983, and while it was held biennially, in some cases, this year, as stated, marks the 30th edition. Since its inception, the conference has brought together participants from central banks, international institutions, and academia, providing a valuable platform for candid and active discussions on central banking in the context of the global, in the context of the evolving global landscape. The theme of this anniversary conference, also as stated, is New Challenges for Monetary Policy. I have just returned from the G7 meetings in Canada, where many of my colleagues looked relieved by the progress made in their fight against inflation. Although they also acknowledged new challenges such as heightened trade policy uncertainty and dealing effectively with more frequent supply shocks. To be honest, I felt slightly left out, not for the first time, because here in Japan, we are still grappling with the long-standing challenge of achieving our 2% inflation target in a sustainable manner, from below, while being mindful of the implications of the zero lower bound on interest rates. That said, the nature of our challenge has evolved considerably in recent years. We are now closer to the target than at any time during the last 3 decades, if not quite there yet. Our recent path has been affected in a unique way by supply shocks. With that in mind, I would like to take a few minutes to reflect on how our experience has evolved and how it compares with that of other countries. I hope that this perspective will provide some useful background for the discussions to come during the conference. Let me begin with the current state of consumer price inflation. This chart 1, shows the headline inflation rates in Japan, the Euro area, and the United States. Inflation surged sharply in the Euro area and in the United States during 2021 to 23. As has been widely documented, a significant part of the surge was driven by supply shocks, which, while temporary by nature, proved to have more persistent effects than initially thought. The subsequent decline in inflation in these economies reflects both the unwinding of those shocks and the effects of monetary tightening by the ECB and the Fed. Excuse me. In contrast, Japan experienced a delayed inflationary response, likely due to inflation expectations having remained anchored at low levels. However, unlike in the Euro area and the United States, inflation in Japan has not moderated significantly since peaking around the start of 2023. As we will see shortly, excuse me, this period has coincided with a gradual rise in inflation expectations. More recently, inflation in Japan has picked up again, excuse me, driven primarily by increases in food prices, most notably rice prices. Over the past 12 months, rice prices have surged by 98%, and the price of non-fresh food as a whole has risen by 7%. In sum, Japan has been hit by two substantial adverse supply shocks. As a result, its current inflation rate exceeds that of both the euro area and the United States. Turning now to policy rates, as shown in this chart, Japan's policy rate remains lowest among the three economies at 0.5%, markedly lower than in the United States, where the rate is above 4%. Chart 3 presents real policy rates calculated just as the nominal rate minus the headline inflation rate. In both the euro area and the United States, real rates are above zero, reflecting inflation rates above target. In contrast, Japan's real policy rate remains deeply negative, despite the similarly positive inflation gap from the inflation target. These broad features of inflation and interest rates are well known. The difficult question is, why has the Bank of Japan maintained such an accommodative policy stance, even after almost 3 years of inflation exceeding 2%? The bank has argued that underlying inflation remains below 2%. This, of course, leads to the next question, what is underlying inflation? In principle, it refers to inflation excluding temporary factors. But in practice, there is no perfect data series that capture this concept. Instead, we say on many occasions, underlying inflation must be judged from something like the totality of data and information on the economy, making communication with the public challenging. We have often faced harsh criticism for perceived lack of clarity. One variable we closely monitor to assess underlying inflation is, of course, inflation expectations. We know that there are many issues about inflation expectations, such as whose expectations matter most and over what horizon. But in this chart, I have selected commonly used measures of medium to long-term inflation expectations for Germany, representing the euro area, and the United States, along with the weighted average of medium to long-term inflation expectations of various agents in Japan. It's a bit complicated for Japan. If you would like, please take a look at the reference in the footnote of the text regarding how we constructed the expectation series for Japan. For Germany and the United States, inflation expectations have remained remarkably stable within a 2 to 3% range, anchored near the inflation targets, even during the nearly 10% inflation episodes of 2022 to 2023. The stability likely reflects the public's confidence in the central bank's ability to maintain price stability. In contrast, Japan's medium to long-term inflation expectations were stuck around 0 to 1% from the late 1990s until around 2013, when large-scale monetary easing was introduced. Inflation expectations rose above 1% in 2014, but fell back to the earlier range by 2016 and stayed there until 2021. Shorter horizon expectations, which are not in the chart, remained even closer to zero, reflecting the deeply entrenched nature of Japan's zero inflation equilibrium. Inflation expectations began to rise again in 2022, responding to global inflation dynamics and Japan's continued monetary easing. They now stand, as you can see from the chart, between 1.5 to 2%, the highest in 30 years, though still somewhat below the 2% target. In other words, we have managed to de-anchor expectations from zero, but have yet to re-anchor them at 2%. This is why we are still maintaining an accommodative policy stance. Communicating this policy stance has been difficult, not only because of the inherent ambiguity in the notion of underlying inflation, but also due to persistent gap between headline and underlying inflation, as shown in the next chart. For the time being, I'm treating inflation expectations as a proxy for underlying inflation. The gap corresponds to the direct effects of the supply shocks and other temporary forces affecting headline inflation. While central banks respond primarily to underlying inflation, the public tends to react to headline inflation. The divergence has always existed to some extent, but the recent magnitude and persistence have been particularly problematic in Japan. Central banks generally adopt a look-through approach to supply shocks, so long as supply shocks are not expected to affect underlying inflation. We also largely looked through the first round of supply shocks, that is, the inflation of imported goods in 2022 to 23. However, Japan's recent experience is unique in the following sense. While headline inflation rose, underlying inflation rose as well. Increases in underlying inflation were driven not only by economic recovery from the pandemic and the tight labor market, but also by the supply shocks as they fed into domestic prices and wages. Now, we are facing another round of supply shocks in the form of food price increases, as I stated earlier. Our baseline view is that the food price inflation is going to wane in the months ahead. However, given that underlying inflation is closer to 2% than a few years ago, we need to be careful about how food price inflation will impact underlying inflation. The relationship between headline and underlying inflation in the face of more frequent supply shocks will likely remain a major focal point for many central banks. In the light of growing uncertainties, particularly those related to trade policy, we have recently revised down our economic and inflation outlook. However, we continue to expect underlying inflation to gradually move toward 2% over the second half of our forecast horizon. As discussed in our quarterly outlook report, there are both upside and downside risks around the baseline scenario. Risks to the economic activity and prices are skewed to the downside for fiscal 2025 and 26. But to the extent that incoming data allows us to gain more confidence in the baseline scenario, we will adjust the degree of monetary easing as needed to ensure the achievement of the sustainable 2% inflation target. In opening this conference, I have shared some thoughts on the challenges for monetary policy in Japan. While many of these challenges are specific to Japan's unique situation, there are also areas of common concern where we can learn together the concept and measurement of underlying inflation and inflation expectations, how best to communicate policies anchored in such concepts, and managing monetary policy under frequent supply shocks. I hope that discussions over the course of this conference will shed light on these critical issues and offer valuable insights for the global central banking community. Thank you.